So with debate around Ms. Essay's Chidima Adechina brewing, the 95 Libyans found in Mpumalanga, 90 Ethiopians in Johannesburg over the weekend, the issue of immigrants is right back in sharp focus. And South Africa is not the only country dealing with the debate on immigrants. The UK, for instance, is seeing ongoing anti-immigration riots where hotels housing asylum seekers are being torched. But really, what is at the heart of these tensions, and what direction should countries be taking where immigration is concerned? Well, let's explore that conversation this morning with Professor Loren Landau, who is with the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. Prof, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was quite a big discussion, isn't it? But let's start perhaps in the UK, where we are seeing these riots, and what you make and how you interpret the riots that are seeing hotels housing asylum seekers even being burnt to the ground, right? What is the message that you think those protesters are sending to their government, and how government should be responding to the very violent images that we're seeing coming out of the UK and the debate around immigration there?
Thank you, and good morning. I think there are two things happening in the UK which resonate very much with what we see with xenophobic violence and attacks here in South Africa. The first is that there are genuine problems and issues that many people in the country are facing. The UK has massive inequality that has grown over the last 10, 15 years, unemployment, economic problems, many of the service deliveries issues that we see here around health, education, etc. And I think primarily what these attacks are is a symbol or a signal to the government, to the authorities, that certain people are feeling left out, that certain people are feeling angry. But because there is not an easy way to do it, because people can't take these grievances through the party and feel that they're being heard, they redirect those to a certain group. And in the UK, what we've seen is that's towards Black and brown people, immigrants, asylum seekers, in ways that's very violent. And I think we see very similar sorts of things here. What do you do about it? Well, I think in the first instance, you just have to hold people accountable for violence. That can never be acceptable. But I think in the long term, you have to create channels, not just to discuss immigration, but to discuss the actual real issues and to reframe these debates, not about what do we do about immigration, but what do we do to actually address people's deep-seated concerns about their futures and the futures of their families.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, because you talk about the similarities there and the issues and concerns that are raised by South Africans. Unemployment, lack of housing, sounds very familiar to us. But I wanted to bring this up because when you start to broaden the discussion and say, okay, what are the ideological similarities here? Aside from the challenges, it becomes quite an interesting discussion. There's a professor of sociology at LSE, Professor Mike Savage, who writes about the UK. He says instances of racist hate crimes have surged in the UK since the 2016 Brexit referendum. The rise of populist nationalism in many parts of the developed world testifies to the resurgence of fears around intensified immigration. So is that a bigger discussion, to be thinking about the ideological positioning of leaders and how they talk about immigration?
I think that it absolutely is. Of course, England and other countries are not, this is not the first time that we've seen this. In the 1980s, there was the skinhead movement was very strong in Europe, particularly strong in the UK, very anti-immigration, very anti-Black. And we're seeing some of those sort of same trends, the same voices, those same discourses resurface, not only in England, but in the United States, Germany, France, etc. Does this mean we need to have a discussion? Absolutely. I think a country like England has never come to terms with the fact that it is a multicultural country. There's still a very strong idea of an English identity, which is a white Christian identity, very class-based, very insular. It is an island after all. We're seeing other debates happening elsewhere. France is having a similar sort of question about what does it mean to be a question that is not white, necessarily not Catholic, and how to cope with these sorts of things. And these are discussions that we have to have. Unfortunately, rather than having a discussion about what kind of future citizenship or nation should we be, politicians, leaders, people on the right are framing the issue as protecting the nation from the changes that will inevitably have to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You make the example of France. I want to almost make the example of the US, where you're seeing a leader like Trump, for instance, gaining even in the black population because of his anti-immigration stance. But let's bring it back home to South Africa and how you find similarity in these discussions with us. I mean, that Chidima Adetshina debate is brewing, and that certainly has brought the issue to the fore, right, around what it means to be a South African, right? So is that a discussion that for a moment gives us some time to really reflect on what kind of nation we are? Are we an outward-looking nation or inward?
Yeah, I think this is an important time for us to be having these discussions. There's always been an important time. South Africa has a different starting point than an England or France. And in that way, it is more like the United States. It is inherently diverse. It makes very little sense to talk about South Africa as a place that can only be for people of the soil. For hundreds of years, the country has been built, has been connected, not just to Europe and the world, but of course, particularly to the neighboring African countries through trade, through family, through movements. So we are a diverse population here, and we need to discuss, what does that mean? How do we build something together? And I hope that this is an opportunity where we can have that discussion and realize that there is very little to be gained by excluding people or by trying to prove that people have a right to be here based on origins going back hundreds of years. Most of us, myself obviously, but many people will find that they have a relative from Malawi, from Mozambique, from somewhere else. And where are we going to take this discussion if we don't create a kind of community that is more open to people coming in from outside?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a tough one to sort of speak to South Africans about, right? And maybe then we need to talk about what we're hearing from leaders. I mean, what's interesting is, for instance, in the run-up to the elections, you had some political leaders saying things like, well, you know, undocumented foreigners need to go, and things like they, you know, even the words abaham, they need to go, being used sometimes in the run-up to these elections. And then, as the formation of this government of national unity happens, you've got the Home Affairs Department, for instance, that says we need to be better at processing work permits. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy on whether or not South Africa's welcoming or not welcoming. What's the right sort of messaging that says, okay, we're not nationalist or we are?
Well, I'm not the one to say what is right or wrong. I think what we can say is South Africa has benefited terrifically over the past 20 or 30 years from highly skilled immigration. While that has created perhaps some challenges within the labor market, we need the skills, we need the investment. We don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough nurses, we don't have enough doctors. We need these skills for South Africa to prosper. We need the investment to create jobs. Does that mean we have to be open to everyone? Not necessarily, but it does mean that we need to have a discussion about how we link migration to development, to growth. Closing our borders to everyone is what England has tried to do over the last few years, coming back to that. And what we've seen is it's had disastrous economic consequences. So if South Africa's real issues are about getting people jobs, getting people services, we can't afford to be, as Mandela said, an island in a sea of desperation. We need to be connected to the rest of the continent and to the rest of the world.
Interesting. So then where do you place the story that made headlines just over a week ago, where 95 Libyans are then found in White River and in Mpumalanga, and there's a belief that they're running a military, allegedly, and possibly running or part of a military camp that is set up within the borders of South Africa. What does that say about relations between South Africa and Libya, and what should we be doing about that?
Well, it's a very disturbing case. I don't know all of the details, and I'm not sure if any of us will ever know all of the details. Clearly, this is not a particularly, I wouldn't frame this as an immigration issue. This is an issue about mercenaries. It's an issue about relationships between potentially corrupt officials at different levels, bringing in guns, bringing in people who are training. I don't know what groups or what sort of ideology these people stand for, but clearly this is about government or others allowing South African territory to be used for military purposes for involvement elsewhere. That's not an immigration issue. That's something about South Africa's international relations. I don't think, from a personal perspective, South Africa should be open to people who want to come in and use the territory for military training. If they want to come in and start businesses that help South Africans, if they want to come in and help train South Africans, or to create trade that can benefit the country, I think that's quite a different matter.
I mean, it's particularly, it stands out because you've got to, of course, note the fact that there is always that relation around where South Africa was fighting for its liberation. It was housed in various other African countries. So is there a responsibility, and perhaps this is a great way for us to wrap up the discussion on, how South Africa sees itself in relation to other countries. Is there a responsibility that South Africa does have to Libya, for instance?
South Africa, I think, as wanting to be a leader on the continent, has a responsibility for diplomacy, for trade, for good relations across the continent. I don't know what group in Libya these people are associated with. The Libyan politics is very divided at the moment. But I think South Africa does have a responsibility to be a good citizen on the continent, to treat neighboring citizens well, and to promote freedom and human rights across the continent. I don't know whether this sort of military training is part of that strategy or could be framed in that way. But I think it does need to have a recognition that as the largest economy on the continent, as a sort of regional Southern African hegemon or dominant force, that comes with certain responsibilities. And that means that it will always be connected outside of its borders.
Yeah, quite the balancing act that we need to run here. And I'm going to just give you one last closing thought here. 90 Ethiopians then found, allegedly, possibly smuggled or human trafficked into South Africa over the weekend, found here in Johannesburg, living in a derelict position. That speaks to weaknesses at our borders. And perhaps you want to talk to us about how that is important as well, even though you talk about the responsibility that we have to other countries, but what do we need to protect?
Right. I mean, the first thing we need to protect is human life and human dignity, and allowing people to be trafficked, if that's what happened, kept into sort of indentured labor, kept in inhumane conditions is not something that any of us should support. Is this something that we can address by closing the border? No. What we've seen from the US, from Europe, the more you try to close the border, the more of these kind of situations you have, because you drive everything underground. I do think what we need then is a pragmatic discussion about how do we manage our borders in a way that recognizes South Africa's relationships and the realities, the depth, the breadth, the width of those borders, what can realistically be done, and how do we engage with the police, how do we engage with the Department of Justice, how do we engage with the Department of Labor to make sure that if people are coming in, they are protected, the South African community is protected, and that we can create a migration system that is dynamic, but also developmental.
Yeah, lots to think about, Prof, and we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Professor Loren Landau from the Center for Immigration and Society. Of course, he's with Wits University.